So we're looking at South America. It's an amazing large continent with many countries and really amazing landforms and just beautiful cultures. So that's what we're going to start with. And we're doing physical geography for this lecture. And we can start with the landform regions. So the first thing to start with is that South America is on its own continental plate. So it's by itself in a way, but it's being run into by the Pacific plate and the Antarctic plate to a degree. But the rest of it's really kind of quiet tectonically speaking because it's away from any plate boundaries. So you can see on the right-hand side, you see this huge mountains. I love this map and this nice topographic map. The mountains that you see are the Andes, and that's because the Pacific plate is running into the South American plate, and it creates a subduction zone off the coast, and then that convergent plate boundary then creates the Andes Mountains with volcanoes, rising mountains, earthquakes, and just kind of it's one of the youngest mountain chains in the world. Peaks go up to 22,000 feet in elevation, and they're rising, and you can kind of see it dramatically on the right-hand side. We'll then also take a look at the old areas, the highlands on the eastern side. So the Guyana highlands up there in the top right, the Brazilian highlands, which we see as that kind of rugged terrain in the right-hand middle part, and then the Patagonian highlands, which is down in the southern part. And in between, we have the lowlands, the Amazon Basin, the Orinoco River, the La Plata. And so we're going to talk about those and how those were formed and discuss those in more detail. So again, looking at plate tectonics, we see the Nazca plate is running right into the South American plate. And on that western side, we see all these volcanoes and earthquakes. It's a very tectonically active, young, young types of landforms that are rising and being created. But on the eastern edge, you can see not a lot of activity, and that's because that's in the middle of a continental plate. There's not really any tectonic activity, and so it's really old and weathered landforms. So they're billions of years old in some places, and they've been weathered away over time, which an important thing to note is that that exposes a lot of mineral wealth. So the Andes has mineral wealth because things are being uplifted and transformed. And on the old sides, the highlands, you also see a lot of it because everything's been weathered away, and now it exposes those, things like gold and silver and diamonds, etc. So a lot of mineral wealth throughout South America, which made it very, yeah, we'll talk about that in terms of the conquest by the Europeans later. So here's the basic way you can look at the physical landforms of South America. On that western side, we have the Western Alpine system. And you can see it on both of these maps. And these are extremely high mountains. And we'll see those coming up to 22,000 feet. There's actually a glacier and a peak that's over 20,000 feet in Ecuador, and it's on the equator. And yet it has a glacier on top of it because it's so high at those elevations. And they're very dramatic. We then have the highlands, the eastern highlands. And I mentioned we'll talk more detail about those. And they're old, weathered ones that are kind of breaking down and exposing a lot of mineral wealth. And then in between, we have the central lowlands. Used to be an inland sea, but because of erosion from the Andes and the eastern islands or highlands, that has like been deposited and created the plains that we see, like the Amazon Basin, for example. So let's start with the Western Alpine system. Of course, we have what are called the Andes. And the Andes are very large, obviously a mountainscape that comes down. It does break into some smaller ranges here and there, but it's basically the Western Alpine system is the Andes. Now, when you get into Peru and going into Bolivia up in the Andes, and this is right in the middle, we have a thing called the Altiplano. And this is a high plateau in the middle between two mountain ranges where the Andes split into two. And it includes places like Lake Titicaca, etc. And so the Altiplano is kind of the heart of the Cusco or the Incan civilization. They came from there and then went up to Cusco. Another important area on this is in this area is the Atacama Desert. That's on the western side of going all the way from Peru all the way down through Chile. And it's one of the driest deserts on Earth. And we'll talk about why that exists coming up. It's like Baja Peninsula here in North America. And then we have the Central Valley of Chile. And you can see that's a little bit further south, but it's very much mirrors what we see in North America. This is like the Central Valley of California. So if you think about North America, you go from Baja up to like things like the Central Coast and then all the way up into like Washington State. It's exactly the opposite in South America on this coastline. And so the Central Valley of Chile is just like California. So let's take a look at that. So here's in the Andes. This is a mountain that when we're on the study abroad program, as we're going toward the Altiplano, and we're driving on a bus, and we get off the bus at 14,800 feet in elevation for lunch. That's higher than Mount Whitney here in California. And we're on the bus. So that mountain right there is over 20,000 feet high and has a glacier. And that this is actually the headwaters of the Amazon. It's the place furthest from the Amazon where water, when it melts, gets into the Amazon on the other side. And I've noticed though, every time I've gone over, the last 14 years, that every year that I look at this glacier, it's smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's at the same time of year, and you just see it receding. It's not the same. I take the same picture almost every year, and you can see it just going back by that, visual photographic record. And this is the Altiplano. As I mentioned, it's between the mountain ranges and it's really, really flat, but it is kind of one of the core areas of civilization from South America, especially the Incan Empire came from this area. It sits at over 12,800 feet in elevation, so it's very high, but it is in the tropics. So it gets pretty cold at night, but relatively warm in the day. And yeah, it's just an amazing place where things like potatoes were domesticated and things like that. So the Altiplano is a very important part of South America, the civilizations that arose. And then here's Lake Titicaca in the Altiplano. The mountains in the background are in Bolivia. On this side, we're in Peru. And during our study abroad, we get to go to Lake Titicaca and we take boats out as you saw actually in the video, and we get to stay on an indigenous island with the Montani, and get to stay there with local families, and play soccer and hike and have a good time and just learn a lot about their cultures. There's also floating islands where people have created islands out of reeds, and they live on these islands floating. And again, this lake is almost at 13,000 feet in elevation, so it's really, really high, but it's a large lake. The Atacama Desert stretches from basically Peru all the way down into Chile. And like I said, as a comparison, we can think of Baja. They're at the same latitudes. It's just this is southern hemisphere, that's the northern hemisphere. You have a really cold ocean currents, just like we have off of California. And you also have a deep upwelling because of the convergent subduction zone. Remember, when those plates collide, they create trenches offshore. And so you have this deep water that comes up, but it's cold. So that it's not a hot desert, it's a cold weather desert. Some areas have never experienced precipitation ever, although you have cloud banks that come in. And this kind of shows a reason for this. So the Atacama Desert is in a rain shadow. The prevailing winds that are coming toward it are coming from actually the east because it's still in the tropics. So you have the southeast trade winds, just like we have the northeast trade winds into the Caribbean. We have the same thing here. So they're coming in this way and they hit the Andes Mountains, and that creates rain on the windward side. But when they cross over the Andes, they descend, they heat up, and there's no moisture. And so the Atacama Desert is in a rain shadow of the Andes. The Central Valley of Chile, you can see that kind of a little further south below the Atacama Desert. It'd be like going from the Baja to here. And it basically, look, here's vineyards. This is where they grow their wine. They do fruits and vegetables and everything. It's really like the Central Valley or Central Coast of California. And that's where the capital Santiago is, down in Chile. So taking a look at that, just this is, again, I really like this map, so you'll probably be annoyed by it, but I think it's a really beautiful map. And it's a topographic one. And it shows these huge mountains, right, running all the way along the western side of South America. We have a subduction zone offshore. We have, the Altiplano does show up on this one. It's right in the middle, and you can see it there where it's kind of more grayish. And then it drops off very quickly into the lowlands afterwards. Now, the eastern highlands. So let's leave the western side and let's go to the eastern side. It's broken up into 3 different areas. It's a little more complex, but basically this is ancient rock. We're talking several billion years of age, and they've weathered away, meaning they've been eroded and stuff from, rainfall and wind and all of these things and erosion. And so that's exploited a lot of, or showed a lot of mineral wealth, whether it's, coal, iron ore, or diamonds and gold and silver. So the Guyana Highlands are up in the north in what we call the Guyanas. We covered that in the Caribbean section because we consider that area part of the Caribbean culturally, but physically it's part of South America. The Brazilian Highlands, right in the middle, and they arise pretty abruptly from the Atlantic Ocean, and they're kind of and are rugged as well. And the further in the south, we have the Patagonian Plateau. And we'll talk about Patagonia in a little bit more detail. If I remember correctly, Samuel in his flip thing said that that's where he wants to go, is to Patagonia. So these are these Eastern Highlands. Here's an example, Guyana Highlands. This is Angel Falls, the highest waterfall in the world, over 3,000 feet that it drops. Not quite a mile, but pretty close. It's higher than Yosemite Falls. And they come off of those highlands into the lowlands. The Brazilian highlands are very similar, very rugged terrain, but again, a place with a lot of mineral wealth. Rio de Janeiro, a famous city, is one where those Brazilian highlands kind of fall off into the ocean, and you can see the kind of the dramatic terrain that that city has. Someday I'll get to go. And down in the far south, on the border of Paraguay and Brazil, as well as Argentina, is Iguazu Falls. This is the Niagara Falls, basically, of South America. And this is where they come off of that Brazilian plateau and it falls into the lowlands. And so those hard rocks stop and you get the softer ones below, and it's been eroded away, and you see the waterfalls that are created by that. And then the Patagonian Plateau in the far south. It runs up into the Andes, but it's a plateau, has some rugged terrain. People often refer to it like it looks like Montana in many ways. It's very cold because it's so far south. And again, as we'll come across, it's actually relatively dry because of it's in a rain shadow, the same as the Atacama Desert, but on the opposite side, where the winds are coming from the west and hitting the Andes, and it's in the rain shadow in that location. It also has a lot of oil wealth and other mineral wealth as well. So here's that example. So we talked about the Atacama Desert earlier, further to the north, where the prevailing winds were coming from the east, hitting the Andes and giving a rain shadow on that Pacific coast. But when you move further south, the winds are now coming from the west, the westerlies. And when they hit the Andes, they rain a lot on that side. And then Patagonia is actually in the rain shadow. Now, it's not a desert per se because it's so cold. You don't have a lot, less evapotranspiration of, because of heat, things of that nature. But it is relatively dry, but it'd be like a thing that we think of like in Montana would be kind of the best idea at the moment of what you think Patagonia looked like. And it's sparsely inhabited because it's pretty big. And again, the climate is not that conducive. So again, that kind of shows those highlands, the Guyana highlands in the north, the Brazilian highlands in the middle, and the Patagonian plateau in the south. Now, in the middle of these, we have the central lowlands. And Originally, these were inland seas when, you know, sea levels were lower or higher, I'm sorry. But then as they receded and then things eroded from the Andes and those highlands, the eastern highlands, that filtered into those central lowlands. And in the north, and here we can see the different regions that we have of those lowlands. Starting in the north, we have the Llanos. This is a river shed, basically. That's the Orinoco river shed. It's very low lying. It's one of the flattest places on earth. The most things that they do, there's cattle ranching and stuff, and there's not a whole lot else, but it's very lowland, very tropical, very hot. And it drains out into into the Atlantic Ocean around Trinidad and Tobago through Venezuela. The Amazon plain is very large. It's the largest watershed in the world, as we'll talk about later. And we saw the headwaters of the Amazon River, but it's all these tributaries that come in and then form the Amazon River, which is the largest river in the world based on volume of water that comes through. 20% of the world's fresh water comes out from the Amazon. Now, as you move a little bit further south, we have some rain shadow effects and a little bit in around 30 degrees, more desert-like conditions, and that's the Gran Chaco. So as those lowlands go, it goes from, tropical rainforest into much drier conditions, more savanna, and eventually steppe climates in the Gran Chaco, right there in the middle. And then it ends in the Pampas. The Pampas is in Argentina for the most part, a little bit of Uruguay. And these are lowlands, but they're grasslands. They're basically like the Great Plains of the United States. So these are grasslands, excellent soils, adequate moisture, and this is the breadbasket of South America where they produce wheat, corn, also cattle. And so it's basically like, the Great Plains going down through Texas. And the Pampas, it looks small in this map, but it's bigger than Texas. So it's a really large region. So here's some pictures. Here's the Amazon plain. This is where the Rio Negro and the Amazon meet, and you see the different types of colors of water that are mixing at this point, because the Rio Negro comes from a different type of highlands that has more blacker, soils are a little bit darker. So you see that's why it's the Rio Negro, and the Amazon is much more brownish from where its sources are coming from, and this is their junction where they come together. The Grand Chaco. Toward the north, you have more savanna landscapes. That's the picture on the top. So you have trees, palms, grasslands. But then as you get further south, it gets a bit drier. And here you see kind of more scrub brush and things like that in the southern part. And then once you get to the Pampas, you have moisture coming in from the Atlantic and creates things that look just like you're in Iowa or North Dakota, and great grasslands and livestock ranching, etc. And so the Pampas is very much like the Midwest of the US. Now, here's the three main river systems, watersheds, I should say. The Orinoco, that goes through the Llanos up through the north. So the Orinoco River, and it actually joins the Amazon during wet years, but that's just a little bit of Jeopardy knowledge. But the Orinoco flows up near Trinidad and Tobago and goes out into the Atlantic in that way. The Amazon's the largest watershed in the world, and all of those rivers going all the way from the Andes on down, they end up heading out through the mouth of the Amazon into the Atlantic. And then the La Plata, it's another series of different rivers, but they come off of the highlands, the eastern highlands, and they go into the La Plata and the Paraná La Plata River, and they come out by Buenos Aires out into that region. And so these are the three main watersheds. And again, those fix in with right in the lowlands, in between the Western Alpine system and the Eastern Highlands. So that creates the landforms that we see in Latin America, and specifically South America, the Andes, the highlands, and the lowlands, and then break those into their specific pieces for the exams. And again, this shows it in a little bit more detail. On the left is a detailed one. On the right is just the map that I really, really enjoy looking at. I think it's just a very beautiful topographic map showing what you see in South America. Now, in terms of climates, this is we talked about this earlier in the course when we did climate in general in the physical geography section. But basically, along the equator, as we see, and it runs right across South America, we have tropical wet. Think about the Amazon basin. Across the equator, it's tropical wet. So it's wet pretty much the year round. Now, as you move either north or south of the equator, you run into tropical savanna, still in the tropics, but now you have a wet season and a dry season. So the one that's north, about 8 degrees, give or take, north of the equator, you run into the tropical savanna climate where the rainy season is in the North American summer. Just like in the Caribbean, right? The rainy season and the hurricane thing, that's in the summer, the North American summer, same thing there. But in the winter, that belt moves south. And so then it becomes a drier season. And that's the dry season, which is the North American winter time. Now, south of the equator, it's opposite. So as it moves down in the North American winter, obviously different than South America or the Southern Hemisphere, in the North American winter, that becomes the rainy season down there. But in the North American summer, it becomes a drier climate. They have a dry season south of the equator. So it's just an opposite of each other. And then as you get further up around 30 degrees north and south, and then also adding in the ideas of the mountain chains and whatnot and the wind patterns, you end up with places that become steppe, which is drier than savanna, and then eventually desert. You can see that north when you get into Venezuela, and you can see it down in the southern hemisphere as well with the Atacama Desert, the Gran Chaco, even Patagonia. And then there's some other types of climates that we're not going to talk a whole lot about in this course, but it'd be important, like here in the United States. And these are mild mid-latitude climates, and they're the C climates. So the CFA climate is humid subtropical, so it's warm and humid, but without a dry season, but hot summers. And that's the southern part of Brazil, Uruguay, parts of Paraguay, as well as Buenos Aires and Argentina. So the best way to think about the CFA climate, that mild mid-latitude, is like Atlanta, Georgia. Just think of the thing. And again, it's reverse in terms of hemispheres. So they're at the same latitude, just south of the equator. And so it's really like the southeast of the US. The CSB climate, that's Mediterranean climate. All right. So that is obviously the Mediterranean, but also our climate here in California, where we have pretty mild climates, can have hot summers, but most of our moisture comes in the wintertime. And that Mediterranean climate is the only one in the world where the majority of the rainfall comes in the winter. Every other place it comes in the summer. And that happens in the same latitude, north and south of the equator on West Coast. So South Africa, the Mediterranean, California, and down here in South America and Chile. So that's that CSB. Again, it mirrors what we see up here in North America, just the other side of the equator. And then the CFB is Marine West Coast. That's like going from San Francisco up to Seattle. Again, it's a mirror of what we have in North America is happening in South America. And you can see that in the southern part of Chile on that western coast. And then highland climates, that's the H one. That's in the Andes. It's just that temperatures vary by altitude, and you can go through every single one of these climate types from the bottom of a mountain to the top. And that's what we call altitudinal zonation. So this is just a general one for Latin America. So you have the Tierra Caliente, which is the hot land. Tierra is land, caliente is hot, so the hot land. And that's kind of the tropical areas along the coastline from sea level up to maybe 3,000 feet. And those are the hot areas along the coastlines. Then, as you get a little bit higher, you have the Tierra Templado, which is the temperate lands. Tierra land, Templada is temperate. And that's from like 3,000 up to 6,000. So with those elevations, and the temperature almost varies much more about elevation than it does about latitude and longitude, because much of South America is within the tropics. And this is places where they grow things like coffee and corn and vegetables and things like that. That's where the Spanish really like to settle. Most of their capital cities are located in that area. They didn't really like the Tierra Caliente because it was just too hot. And then as you get a little bit higher, from 6,000 feet up to 12,000 feet, it depends on where you are, is the Tierra Fria, the cold land. And here you can grow things like wheat and barley and tubers, lot more sheep, guinea pigs, of course, llamas, alpaca, etc. And then you get even higher from 12,000 feet up. That's the Tierra Helada. That's the frozen lands. And so there you can do some things like quinoa, um, alpaca, llamas, things like that that you grow in those areas. And then you get to the snow line, and nobody really wants to live there above, you know, 16,000 feet. But I've been in villages that are over 14,000 feet in elevation, and you can see the different things they can grow at those different elevations. So again, here the things are not about latitude as much as they are about altitude, especially in the Andes. Now, vegetation really mirrors the climate, obviously. So in the tropical wet climates, you have tropical rainforest. And we'll look at those in a little bit more detail coming up, but these are forests in the tropics where it rains a lot. So it basically explains itself. And there's just a lot of biodiversity. It's mostly in the trees and the foliage, as well as in the fauna and other things and the animals that are living up in the canopy. On the ground, it's actually pretty sparse because not a lot of light makes it down to the actual surface. Tropical savannas on either side, same thing with the climates. And here it starts going from tropical rainforest into more woodlands and eventually into grasslands as you move north or south of the equator. And then it blends as you get around 30 degrees north or south of the equator. You end up in steppe climates, which are semi-desert, shrubs and low grasses, and then eventually into deserts like shrubs and cacti that you would see in places like the Atacama Desert, the northern part of South America. And then we do have grasslands in the mid-latitude climates. So we're talking about those green ones, right? And Argentina, southern Brazil, Uruguay, and that's the Pampas. So it's very much like the southeast of the US, but also some of those grasslands you can think of in the Great Plains. And then in southern Chile and the highlands, because you have those west coast, the marine climates, etc., and that rainfall, it's kind of very similar to what we see in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. So you have evergreen forest. And in the highlands, as you move up, you run into different types of forests, and we can talk about that later. All right, we're gonna take a break right now, and yeah, and we'll come back and talk about some environmental issues and whatnot before we talk about population. All right, thank you, and see you in a moment.